I'm James Hitchcock, Professor of History at St. Louis University, and this is the first of 6 lectures on the subject of Roman Catholic modernism, which refers to a school of theology and philosophy that surfaced around 1900 and which was ultimately condemned by the Church as a heresy and has remained one of the most controversial episodes in modern Catholic history. What does modernity itself mean? If you had, we conventionally divide history into ancient, medieval, and modern. Obviously, if you had asked Julius Caesar, for example, what period of history are you living in, he would have looked at you with puzzlement and would have said, well, I'm living in the present. And if you had asked Thomas Aquinas, what period of history are you living in, he would have said the same thing. Everyone is living, by definition, in the modern age, whenever it is that they're alive. It was only much later that people started referring to the ancient world, or in the 19th century they coined the expression Middle Ages as the period between the ancient and the modern world. But one of the characteristics of modernity is that people have a heightened sense that they are living in a new age when things are different. They have a heightened sense of sort of discontinuity between the present and the past. They have a sense of the past becoming perhaps more and more remote and distant from them, not just in terms of years, but also in terms of the way people think and act. And that brings us into what can be called perhaps modernism. Modernity is the mere fact of being alive in modern times. And modernity has certain characteristics, which we will be talking about. But modernism rises to the level of an ideology or philosophy in which you become very conscious of the fact that you're living in modern times. You become almost obsessed with what characterizes modernity, and you have, as I say, an increasing sense perhaps that the past is receding, that the past is distant from you. And this has a lot to do with the heresy of modernism. The word modernism, as it applies to the Church, was actually coined by Pope Pius X, who was later canonized as a saint, when he condemned the heresy of modernism in 1907. And we'll see later what some of the full implications of that are. When does the modern world begin? Well, it's fairly customary in freshman college history courses perhaps to take the date 1500 as a convenient dividing line. But you can push it forwards and backwards depending upon what criteria you want to employ. Some people have identified the origins of modernity as early as the 14th century with the philosophical movement that was called nominalism, because the nominalists had serious doubts about the ability of the human mind to really understand the truth. They were not nearly as optimistic about human reason as Thomas Aquinas had been in the 13th century. So some people argue that the retreat from the high philosophical tradition of the Middle Ages and a kind of growing skepticism about reason marks modernity. I myself don't think that that influence was the primary one. Beginning somewhat later than that, beginning perhaps around 1400, is the phenomenon which we call the Renaissance. And certainly the people of the Renaissance, the scholars who called themselves humanists, were very conscious of a sharp break from what went before. They tended on the whole to reject or to criticize or maybe to ignore the high philosophical tradition of the Middle Ages, which they viewed as too abstract, too remote from human existence. The term Renaissance, rebirth, was not coined until the 19th century, but the idea is certainly there already in the 15th century. These people who want to see a rebirth of the classical civilization of Greece and Rome and look upon themselves as the people who are going to bring that about. Now, that's a very interesting idea, rebirth, in terms of modernity, because they don't use the rhetoric of saying, let's get up to date. They don't use the rhetoric of saying, let's move with the times. They criticize their predecessors, like Thomas Aquinas, by saying that he had departed too far from the early culture of the Greeks and the Romans. The Renaissance humanists are, at least officially, backward-looking, not forward-looking. They're conscious of living in a new age, but it's a new age that they think ought to be a rebirth of an old age, a rebirth of a time that was in fact dead. Around the year 1500 occur some events which are going to have a profound impact on the modern world, although their full significance was not realized until somewhat later, and that was the Great Age of Discovery, the age in which the Europeans began going out in all directions, across the Atlantic, around the southern tip of Africa and over to the Far East. Sudden discovery by Europeans that there's a vast world out there with which they had very little contact, and their determination to explore it, to discover it, to explore it, and to exploit it in various ways. There's been much discussion about what motivates the Europeans to do this. Why, at this particular moment in history, around 1500, they are so dynamic and aggressive and curious in ways that the other societies in the world of that time were not. There were other societies, notably China and Japan, that actually wanted to keep out the outside world, while the Europeans wanted to sort of embrace the whole globe. In the long run, as I say, that will have a tremendous effect in defining what the modern world is like, although it will take a while before the implications of that are clear. Almost simultaneous with the great age of exploration comes the Protestant Reformation, which begins effectively in 1517 when Martin Luther nails the famous 95 Theses to the door of the church. This incident, the nailing of the 95 Theses and the Reformation in general, has often, I think, been misunderstood. The incident is a very dramatic one. Martin Luther nailing a document to the door of the church in which he calls into question certain teachings and practices of the church. If today a Catholic priest, a professor in a Catholic university were to do that, nail some kind of a manifesto to a church door, it would, of course, the television cameras would be there, the newspapers would be there, it would be seen clearly as a dramatic act of defiance. Actually, Luther at the time was calling for an academic debate, and the church door was often used as a kind of a bulletin board. Nonetheless, the principle is still there. While Luther may have been surprised at the intensity of the reaction that he got, he then did stick by his guns and refused to back down. And he found himself, perhaps in a sense, pushed farther than he may have originally intended to go in terms of his questioning of Catholic teaching. So that when he finally does have his debate, which takes place a couple of years later, he finally says, well, all right, popes can be wrong, general councils of the church can be wrong, only the Holy Scripture is reliable. a position more radical than the one he started out with in 1517. And then a couple of years after that, when he is summoned before the German emperor to answer for his ideas, he makes a famous speech which includes the sentence, "Here I stand, I can do no other." And in some versions of the speech, of which there are several, he says, "I must follow my conscience because it is neither safe nor right to do otherwise." Now, this too is a very dramatic incident, which is one of the most famous incidents in all of history and has sometimes been cited as the beginnings of the modern world. Well, why the beginnings of the modern world? Because, it is said, here is one lone individual who stands up and defies the universal church and the empire, both the religious authority and the political authority, and who says, "My conscience alone is my guide," which we can see, of course, as a very distinctively modern position. But as a matter of fact, Luther's use of the word conscience in that speech, if indeed he did use it, was different than what modern people are likely to assume. Luther did not believe that a position was right because he thought it was right. He would never have said, "My judgment is the ultimate criterion of truth." Luther instead said that we must defer always to the words of Holy Scripture. And Luther, we sometimes say that this was the principle of the private interpretation of Scripture, but Luther didn't see it that way. He didn't think that every person should read the Scripture in a subjective fashion, whatever it means to you. Luther thought that if sincere Christians studied the Scripture, they would all arrive at the same conclusions. And he was very upset later when he began encountering people whose faith he respected, but who did in fact reach certain different conclusions from himself. So in that sense, Luther is not a modern man. Luther is not saying that private judgment is the ultimate criterion of truth, although he's often cited that way. In the famous play and movie A Man for All Seasons about St. Thomas More, there is a section which is also quite misleading when it comes to More himself, in which he's arguing with his son-in-law, and he's saying about the position he takes, "It is crucial because I believe it. It is crucial because I believe it." And so in the context of the play and the film, you're invited again to think of More really as a modern man who invokes the authority of his own conscience against the authority of the king. In reality, however, that was not More's position at all. He was invoking the authority of the church against the authority of the king. And rather than positioning himself as a lone individual, More was identifying himself with all the centuries of Christianity that had come before and with all the other parts of the world where the church then existed outside of England. So he was the exact opposite of an individualist, so the play and the movie somewhat misrepresent him. Nonetheless, one of the major results of the Reformation, even though unintended, was the fragmentation of religious belief in the Western world. Early on, Luther has a break with the Swiss reformer Ulrich Zwingli over how to understand the words of Jesus, "This is my body, this is my blood." They go their separate ways. A little later on, there arises another Swiss reformer, John Calvin, who doesn't reject Lutheranism, but who has different emphases of his own. And so he goes his way. There is the so-called radical Reformation, which is people who have interpretations of the gospel quite unsatisfactory to people like Luther and Calvin. They don't believe in infant baptism. They don't believe in private property. They are pacifists. They don't believe in an ordained clergy, and so on and so forth. So what results, quite contrary to what Luther hoped for or intended, was in fact fragmentation of belief. What we call now, in somewhat more positive terms, pluralism, a plurality of belief, pluralism of belief, some of which are ideas held in common, but which are also based on significant differences. And the claim of the Catholic Church prior to about 1520, that the Christian faith is one, everyone in Europe shares the same Christian faith, the Christian faith is authoritatively articulated by the Church, that claim after about 1520 can never be made again because of the growing diversity of religious movements, of Christian religious movements. If we take the United States today, no one could even say how many Christian denominations there are because there are so many independent groups that are not officially incorporated or they're not affiliated with any established church, and such groups are being started faster than anybody could actually record them. But we know that the number of independent Christian groups that are not associated with one another certainly runs well into the thousands. Now, there's a very important aspect to this with respect to modernity and also with respect to modernism. Theoretically, there could be 10,000 points of view, and 9,999 of them are wrong and one of them is right. That's a possibility. Psychologically, however, when you see a diversity of viewpoints, when you see people strongly disagreeing with one another, the tendency is to say, well, they must all be wrong, at least to some degree. They're all so sure of how right they are, and yet they disagree sharply with one another, and so each one of them must be partly right and partly wrong. Now, this, as I say, was certainly far from the intention of Martin Luther or John Calvin, but it was a long-range psychological effect of the Reformation. In the 17th century, there occurs the great phenomenon called the scientific revolution, which is the first modern challenge to Christianity that is not internal, but it comes actually from the outside. And the first great issue here, of course, is the question of whether the earth or the sun is the center of the universe. And for many centuries, going all the way back to Aristotle, learned people had believed that the earth was the center of the universe. But by the later Middle Ages, there were coming to be some problems with this. It was harder and harder to reconcile what people could see in the heavens, the movement of the stars and so forth, compared with the belief that the earth was stationary in the middle. So in the 16th century, a Polish Catholic priest, Nicholas Copernicus, proposes the sun-centered or heliocentric theory of the universe, in which the earth is moving around the sun. His book at first doesn't attract a great deal of attention, but some years later, 60 years later, the Italian scientist Galileo Galilei writes a book attempting to present Copernicus's argument to educated people. And Galileo is called in by Catholic authorities in Rome, by the Inquisition, and he's told that you cannot do that. Now, the issues here are quite complicated. One of them, and I don't want to go into all of them in detail, one of the issues is the authority of Aristotle. because the Catholic Church had really embraced Aristotle in the 13th century. And so if someone comes along now in the 17th century and says that Aristotle's astronomy was wrong, then it may call into question all other aspects of Aristotle's philosophy, to which the Catholic Church, through Thomas Aquinas, was strongly committed. To some degree, the new astronomy contradicted common sense. The Earth doesn't seem to be moving. If it is moving at some enormous rate of speed, why aren't we thrown off as it goes around? Why does it seem to us that the stars are moving or the sun is moving? But what was probably the key issue here was the fact that in the Bible there are places which refer to the movement of the sun. God made the sun stand still in the heavens until the Israelites could defeat their Canaanite enemies. And a famous line from a psalm, the sun also rises, returning to the place from whence it came. So St. Robert Bellarmine, who was the leading Catholic theologian of the time, said to Galileo, for the sake of a scientific theory, and it's only a theory, Bellarmine said, you are threatening the faith of people. You are going to lead people to think that the Bible is erroneous. Now, it's important to recognize what is being said or is not being said in that particular incident. Galileo never said that the Bible was false. What he said was what would come to be accepted, I think, by most Christians eventually, is the Bible does not intend to teach us scientific truth. The way he put it in one place was, the Bible teaches us how to get to heaven, it doesn't teach us about the heavens. And so Galileo said when they use phrases like the sun rises, they're simply using the language of that time. Also, on the other side, St. Robert Bellarmine was not saying that if reason finds something to be true and faith contradicts it, that then reason must give way. Both Bellarmine and Galileo believed that reason and faith had to be harmonious. They could not be in conflict with one another. So if they were in apparent conflict with one another, then there has to have been an error made on one side or the other. And Bellarmine had a point, which was to say to Galileo, as I've indicated, this is, after all, a theory. It hasn't been proven, and it wouldn't be proven, in fact, for some time to come. They end up with Bellarmine saying to Galileo, all right, if you want to teach this as a theory of astronomy, okay, but you must not tell people that this is true. Then some years later, Galileo, apparently thinking that this arrangement has now expired, writes a second book in which he gets into trouble again. By this time, Bellarmine is dead, and this time Galileo is forced to recant his claim about the sun as the center of the universe. Now, this is an extremely important episode, of course, in modern intellectual and religious history. And it has a great deal to do, of course, with the nature of modernity on several levels. It is the first great incident of what has sometimes been called the warfare of science and religion, which will come into being over things like the age of the world, the theory of evolution, any number of other things along the way, and which still, in fact, goes on today with varying degrees of intensity. The Catholic tradition in modern times, beginning in the later 17th century, has generally been one of respecting the findings of science and saying that the findings of science do not constitute a threat to the faith, so that, for example, one would not necessarily have to believe in literal 7 days of creation. One could believe in some form of evolution, providing you said that God inserted a soul at some point. But among some Catholics as well as among some Protestants, the tension or the conflict between religion and science has been a characteristic of modernity. There's another aspect to this. Religious truth, as I said, was in a way compromised by the fact that there were competing voices, different schools of thought that were each claiming to be right. And the more there were of these different schools of thought, the less credible perhaps any one of them became. There was a growing tendency, again, although this was certainly not Luther's intention, to think of religion as something very subjective and personal. I know religion is true because it is meaningful to me. I have found God in my life. I maybe can't prove it, but it's real to me. But it means that it has no claim to objective validity for everyone. Science, on the other hand, goes in just the opposite direction in the 17th century. The scientists say, we know absolutely the difference between truth and falsehood. When we propose an idea, it's true. It has been proven. We have the evidence to support it. No intelligent person can really reject this. The very word science undergoes a change. Science is from the Latin word meaning to know. And in the Middle Ages, they spoke of theology as the queen of the sciences, because theology deals with the highest of all reality, namely God. And theology was not viewed as a personal, subjective thing, but it was viewed again as objective. Thomas Aquinas' proofs for the existence of God, for example. But beginning in the 17th century, the word science is taken over, as it were, by the physical sciences, so that eventually people will stop referring to theology as a science. They will stop referring to philosophy as a science. And the word science will be reserved uniquely for the physical sciences, for those things which can be put into the form of mathematical equations. That is a science. Only if you have things in the form of mathematical equations do you have a real science. So not only is the authority of religion in the 17th century weakened in some ways by this conflict between science and religion, but the authority of science gets an enormous boost by the claim, which is apparently proven, that the scientists really know what they're doing, and when they make a statement, you can rely on it. And that too is one of the chief defining characteristics of modernity. The great scientists of the 17th century were almost all Christians, and serious Christians. Certainly Galileo was. He was very devout. The greatest scientist of the age, Isaac Newton, was a very seriously religious man who spent decades of his life in theological speculations of one kind or another. Newton and others believed that the new science did not weaken religion but strengthened it, because it showed, they thought, that this wonderfully harmonious and rational universe had to have a presiding intelligence, a God. There was no other way of explaining it. In the 18th century, however, people began to take some of these same principles of rational investigation and apply them in a way to human society, to politics, to the social order, and above all, to religion. And to do it in an unfriendly way often, a skeptical way, the movement which dubbed itself the Enlightenment. Now, the very word enlightenment, of course, is a loaded word. We are enlightened, implying that those who came before us were living in darkness. Now, there was some humility in the Enlightenment in the sense that a man like Voltaire, for example, who's the chief figure perhaps of the Enlightenment, who would defer to the great geniuses of the 17th century like Newton, and would say things like, we stand taller than they because we stand on the shoulders of giants. But they thought of themselves as taking the principle of rational inquiry, which the scientists were employing, and as I say, applying them in areas where they had not been applied before. And in particular, they are using reason in a very skeptical way. Instead of trying to build up great systems of understanding and analysis, as Thomas Aquinas had done, the men of the Enlightenment, who were usually called philosophes, a word which can't just be translated as philosopher, it's more like intellectual, the philosophes cast a skeptical eye at everything. They were always asking why, how do you know? They were scoffing, they were making fun, they were satirizing. They agreed with Newton that the universe made no sense if there were not a superior intelligence who created the universe and planned it. But they thought that you could know little or nothing about this great intelligence. They refused to identify this great intelligence with the God of Judaism or Christianity or any other religion for that matter. And they thought that organized religion was essentially false, and as a matter of fact, not only false, but pernicious, that it had a bad effect because it kept people, they thought, in ignorance and fear and superstition. They explained religion as people don't understand what's going on, and so when they don't understand, they make up things. They make up stories of one kind or another, and so that's what the Bible really is. That's what religion really is. They're frightened, they pray to some God, but the great intelligence who presides over the universe does not hear prayers. This great intelligence does not intervene in human affairs. This is what we usually call deism, the remote God, the impersonal God, the God who has nothing to do with human beings. So it's in the 18th century that we have the first head-on assault on Christianity itself, and in fact on any concept of revealed religion, any concept that God has made himself known to man, whether it be Christianity, Judaism, Islam, whatever it may be. That's impossible. And that it is also, as I say, not only wrong, but pernicious, that it stands in the way of progress. Religion keeps people in ignorance, and it stands in the way of progress. Therefore, it must be eliminated. There is not a straight line between the skepticism of Voltaire and the destructiveness of the French Revolution, but there is at least a crooked line. Voltaire probably would have disapproved of the violence of the revolution had he lived, because he would have seen it as unchecked passion. But on the other hand, Voltaire's antagonism to the church, the decades in which French intellectuals had built up this antagonism to the church, was of such a nature that it was inevitable and natural, once the political and social order started to collapse, that the church would be attacked with especial vehemence. And the same skepticism which was used to discredit the church was, of course, used to discredit the monarchy and, in fact, the whole political and social order of France. The attack on the church, of course, was savage, with thousands of martyrs, especially priests and nuns, who were guillotined for no other reason than the fact that they were priests and nuns, in which churches were closed, turned into stables, deliberately defiled, in which the practice of the Christian religion was outlawed, and so on. This only lasted a relatively brief period, a few years, before the government began to think that they were alienating too many people this way, because most people still were believers, and so they allowed religious freedom again on a limited basis. But the French Revolution was an important and highly traumatic episode because It demonstrated the vehemence that was there on the part of some people against religion, the fact that the anti-religious philosophy of people like Voltaire was not something just in the pages of a book, but that it had real practical applications. And it meant that that vehement anti-religious attitude, willing, if necessary, to use violence, would become itself a permanent element in the modern world that has been employed by various modern governments in varying degrees of rigor to exterminate or at least to weaken an influence which they consider pernicious. Since the 18th century, Christianity has been controversial in the Western world in the sense that there have been always a substantial and influential body of opinion that thinks of Christianity as false and pernicious. Previous to the 18th century, Catholicism had been controversial since the 16th century, but Christianity itself had been assumed to be basically true. A few years before the French Revolution, there occurred, of course, the American Revolution. And the story of the American Revolution is quite different as far as religion is concerned. Very quickly, the new American government committed itself to what we call separation of church and state. At the federal level, there was to be no official church of any kind. And it also committed itself in the Bill of Rights to religious liberty. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The first country in the world to do either of these things, the first country in the world both to separate church and state and to say we have no official religion, and to guarantee everybody's religious freedom. Now, it would take some decades to work out what all this meant. In fact, it's still not entirely settled as to what it all means. But it was an extremely important step. The American experiment of 1787, 89 was also, in one sense, the first democracy in the history of the world, or at least the first democracy since ancient times, perhaps we should say. Political theorists for many centuries had explained why democracy can't work in the end, because you really can't trust the people. And the founding fathers of the United States wrestled with that idea. Can you trust the people? And if the people show certain traits which maybe are dangerous, how does one cope with that? It's also pointed out, of course, that the early government of the United States was not democratic in the fullest sense. There were checks placed on the power of the people. But nonetheless, it was a radical experiment in terms of what had gone before. Now, inherent in this democratic idea is, of course, the idea of equality. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson had said, "All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights." So we're all equal, and we have certain inalienable rights, which means rights that are not conferred on us by government, but are conferred on us either by nature or by their Creator, as Jefferson said, and which may not be taken away, and any government that tries to take our rights away from us is acting wrongly, and we as the people can rise up and strike at the government, a kind of a reversal of the traditional role. The democratic idea begins to catch on very rapidly, so that during the course of the 19th century, some form of democracy, to greater or lesser degree, comes to be adopted in most of the countries of the Western world, as they say, to varying degrees. Even countries which maintain a monarchy, and of course some do even to the present time, the monarchy becomes increasingly remote and ceremonial as the real power is in fact at the ballot box. And during the course of the 19th century, the liberties which are guaranteed in the American Constitution are little by little extended to pretty much everybody else in the Western world by their own governments, or recognized, I should say, by their own government. So again, one of the chief characteristics of modernity is democracy, the voice of the people. We are all equal. We have a right to be heard. We are self-governing. Now, there are certain troublesome things about this. Can one say, well, the people are always right? That would seem to be a very foolish position. Abraham Lincoln said you can fool all of the people some of the time and some of the people all of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all the time. And he was making what amounted to a practical argument for democracy, that on average it works better than other systems. But there is again a nagging question which I think modern democratic societies have not fully resolved, but which is again one of the ingredients of modernity. Namely, must the popular will, must popular opinion be treated as though it's right? Can you go against popular opinion? Can you tell the people they're wrong? If you do that, are you being elitist? Are you denying equality? Well, for a long time, people did not interpret political democracy that way. They didn't understand that because you trusted the people to cast a vote, that meant the people were infallible. But as I say, it remains in a sense an unanswered question in modern democracy, which keeps popping up from time to time. Think, for example, of the importance of opinion polls in our society, and the frequent implication that if you show that 67% of the people think thus and so, it must be true, and who therefore would question it, something that raises serious problems for religion. In the early 19th century, there is a reaction against the Enlightenment, and it's a reaction which to some extent benefits religion in the movement which is called Romanticism. Now, the word Romanticism simply comes from the word for Rome, the city of Rome. It was used by Northern Europeans to describe an attitude which they thought of as characteristic of the Mediterranean, of Italy. Putting it simplistically, it is a complex phenomenon. Romanticism is a reaction against what they see as the extreme rationalism of the Enlightenment and the negativity of the Enlightenment. And the Romantics, in effect, say, look, life is far more complex, more subtle, more profound, more mysterious than human reason can understand. They were often asserting human feeling, human passion against reason. Not all the Romantics by any means were favorable to Christianity, but some were. And Romanticism in general tended to create an atmosphere favorable to Christianity in the sense of saying that not everything can be put under a microscope. Not everything can be subjected to skeptical reason. The world is a more mysterious place than we realize. And therefore, maybe classical religion is actually onto something. And Romanticism, too, becomes a permanent element in defining modernity. So that on the one hand, while we are very much under the influence of science and rationality and skepticism, that's a permanent a legacy of ours from the 17th and 18th centuries, we also tend to think, well, that's not all there is. And especially, I think, in more recent times, there has been a tendency to exalt more and more subjectivity, my view of reality, my personal experience, my outlook on life as something that should be respected. And this can be seen as one of the legacies of Romanticism. Now, the Enlightenment has another long-standing modern effect, which is in philosophy. And it can be seen here as beginning in the 17th century with the French philosopher Rene Descartes. And Descartes starts out by asking a very simple question. In a sense, I guess it's the question that all philosophers ask. How can I be sure that I know the truth? How do I know the truth? And Descartes says, well, there's a very simple way of doing it. He said, doubt anything you possibly can. He said, if there's anything that you can possibly doubt, doubt it. And Descartes immediately started out and found out he could doubt just about anything. I could doubt that I'm actually standing here speaking to a TV camera and that somewhere out there is an audience of people who will hear me. That could be an illusion, it could be a daydream, it could be I'm crazy. The one thing that Descartes could not doubt was that he existed. Even if he doubted everything else, he says, I'm here. I can't doubt that. Now, then from there he sort of thought he would build up everything step by step by step, including the existence of God. It's one of those things, doubt is usually easier than affirmation, and I think people found it easier to follow Descartes' doubts than it was to follow the way in which he built things back up again. And in fact, he didn't leave a lasting legacy of people who believed in the positive aspect of his philosophy, but he made the obligation of doubt, the obligation of skepticism, a permanent legacy of our culture. It was certainly one of the things which fed into the Enlightenment. And modern philosophy, to one degree or another, has almost all been characterized by a skepticism of one kind or another about the ability to know the truth, and attempts to get around that in one way or another. Perhaps the most influential of modern philosophers at the end of the 18th century, the end of the Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant, who says that the mind does not know reality in and of itself. The mind only knows reality as it is presented to the mind. What he calls phenomena, the things which manifest themselves to us, and we cannot say with certainty that what manifests itself to our minds is really there, or if it is really there, whether we can know it. And since the time of Immanuel Kant, modern philosophy has gone in all kinds of different directions. Some of it has been highly subjective. Well, if we can't know things for sure with our reason, then maybe we should rely upon our subjective experiences of reality. Some of it has gone in the direction of narrowing philosophical problems further and further down until you're analyzing the meaning of words, or you're analyzing the meaning of sentences, and your philosophy becomes the study of language itself without any claim that the language reflects some reality beyond it. And just as modern Christianity since the 16th century has been fragmented in innumerable directions, so modern philosophy has been fragmented in innumerable directions. And we could rattle off perhaps a dozen or more major schools of modern philosophy. So not only do the theologians not agree with each other anymore, but the philosophers don't either. If the theologians do not agree on what it is that divine revelation teaches us, the skeptical intellectuals don't agree either. Just as Luther thought that the Bible had one meaning that all Christians would see, Voltaire believed that reason would invariably lead you to the same conclusions. Anybody who used reason would arrive at the same conclusions. But that turns out not to be the case either. So, an extremely important reality then about modernity is, again, we keep coming back to it, this sense of fragmentation, this sense of division, this sense of the absence of any agreement. And that is the overall cultural context in which we have to look at the specific subject we'll be dealing with here, and that is the theological movement which is called modernism. Now, I've alluded to the fact that modernity and modernism are two different things. And as I've said, modernity is merely whatever it is that's characteristic of the modern world. And I've tried to describe what those major things are. We have no choice but to accept modernity in the sense that that's where we live. And none of us are in a position to significantly change the nature of modernity in any real way. We may contribute to long-term things which may change it. And in one sense or another, whether you approve it or not, you have to learn how to get along in the modern world. It doesn't necessarily mean that you embrace it, and you may avoid certain aspects of it. But modernism, as I said earlier, is a kind of a philosophy or an ideology that does really embrace modernity, which makes modernity into a positive good. It's often been said that one major difference between the modern viewpoint and the more traditional viewpoint is that in the past, people tried to emphasize continuity. So you'll have Thomas Aquinas, for example, of the 13th century, quoting Augustine, living in the 4th century, and saying, see, I'm only repeating what Augustine said previously, whereas in fact, he's saying something rather different from what Augustine said. But Aquinas was not interested in proving to people that he was highly original, just the opposite. But in the modern world, you kind of have to exaggerate your originality. We have all these scandals about people plagiarizing and so forth. You have to emphasize your originality because of the assumption that what's new is better and what's old is probably outmoded. And a very strong sense that really there's a kind of obligation to move with the times. That each age has a kind of a spirit, what the Germans call the Weltanschauung, the world spirit, and that those people who resist that in some way are really kind of discrediting themselves. So you have expressions like, well, he's a dinosaur, or that's a Neanderthal point of view, or somebody dragged kicking and screaming into the 21st century, or that kind of rhetoric. And you have people who may in fact think of themselves as accepting traditional beliefs and traditional values, who will nonetheless want to preface their remarks by saying, well, I'm not old-fashioned, you understand, but. And modernism then, as I say, and it manifests itself in innumerable ways, in the arts, in philosophy, in religion, and in popular morals and customs and so on. Modernism is the assumption that what is new is better. Modernism is the assumption that the old is quickly outlived its usefulness. And that, as I say, there really is an obligation to get into touch with the modern world. Now this, as I say, is the overall cultural intellectual environment in which we will be looking at the Catholic phenomenon called modernism. These attitudes were hanging over the heads of Catholics in the 19th century in exactly the same way that they were hanging over other people's heads as well. Perhaps I shouldn't say in exactly the same way, but they were nonetheless there. But on the other hand, the Catholic Church, like every other community or institution, had its own distinctive history. The way in which the Catholic Church had experienced modernity was not necessarily the same way other people had experienced modernity. And that too will be directly relevant to our main subject. And so in my next talk, I will be discussing modernity as experienced by the Catholic Church.